Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today I have another special guest with me, Dr. David Owen Filson. He's a lot of stuff. I'll have him introduce himself here, but he just finished up his PhD a year or two back on Van Til, Cornelius Van Til, a hero of mine. And so today we're going to be talking philosophy and theology. We might get into some nature and life stuff, but it's just a real treat for me. We started as Instagram friends and then liking each other's stuff, and he's been a constant source of encouragement through Instagram comments. So it's really fun to have him on the podcast and see kind of face-to-face today. So without further ado here, Dr. Filson, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, Parker.
For all the listeners and watchers here, there's this fantastic library behind Dr. Filson here, and he just gave me the tour, and it was fantastic. So be jealous of that, but don't sin there. Dr. Filson, what do you do, man? So you are everywhere. I see you on Instagram. I see you ordaining famous pastors' kids. I see you, with high school students, with master's students. Can you just go over briefly, like what you do?
I eat a lot of chips and queso. That's the main thing.
Okay. All right. That's what you're powered by.
And smoke cigars and drink bourbon. Those are things that I do. No, I'm a pastor in the Presbyterian Church in America, in the Nashville Presbytery of the PCA, and from Nashville originally, and did my MDiv at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Met and married my wife, Diane, there. We moved back down here to take care of my father, who was sick at the time with Alzheimer's. We helped my mom take care of him before he passed away. So we moved down here and started pastoring in the Nashville area, and then worked over the years on my doctoral degree through Westminster Theological Seminary, where I'm now an adjunct professor. I teach, like I taught for Scott Oliphant this past spring as he was on a sabbatical. I taught Apologetics 213 for him there, and I teach church history courses, historical theology courses there. And I'm also a visiting lecturer for RTS Atlanta and RTS Charlotte in historical theology and apologetics. I'm on staff at Christ Presbyterian Church as an associate pastor, and I am the pastor for theology and discipleship at Christ Presbyterian Academy, which is a pre-K through 12 covenant school here in Nashville. So I oversee spiritual life here and all of the Bible curriculum. I'm basically a pastor for the school, but I also teach apologetics for the upper school. And that has been it's really interesting to teach apologetics at Westminster or at RTS to masters and master students, and like even now have a THM independent study student. And then to also teach it for high school students, it's really
the full range, man. Yeah.
And I feel like, man, I tell you, the evangelistic opportunities that I have with high school students in a Christian school, because here's the thing: people think, well, you teach in a Christian school, all the kids are Christians. Well, of course, that's simply not true.
Right.
And when you have high school students, you have teenage problems, right? And the evangelistic opportunities I've had, quite frankly, through teaching a fairly unvarnished Van Tilianism here, with a little C.S. Lewis to bring it home at a really personal level. But quite honestly, what the kids are getting here is an attenuated version of a covenantal apologetic, and that with some love and pastoring, it just breaks the walls down. And I have the privilege of, right here in the Hobbit, what we call the Hobbit Hole, which is my library, kids call it the Hobbit Hole, praying with kids to receive Christ as their Savior. So it's and then I also chair the Theological Examining Committee for the Nashville Presbytery of the PCA. I chaired the Theological Examining Committee for the denomination a few years back, but I've been chairing the Theological Examining Committee for the Nashville Presbytery now for about 18 years. And sometimes you'll see me, like, for instance, a dear friend of mine, Ray Ortland, who is an Acts 29 pastor and at Emmanuel Church, he'll have me come over just as a kind of a show of unity here in Nashville and participate in ordination exams when they're ordaining one of their pastors. And so that's always a sweet time of fellowship. So,
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, you got your fingers in a lot of pies here. And you still find time to lift, which I appreciate, man. I love following your Instagram, seeing you lift.
yeah, I do a lot of forklifts, a lot of like mashed potatoes and
Yeah.
gravy over here, a little meatloaf over here. Forklifts are my
Yeah.
main exercise. No, I do. I try to go about 6 days a week
Okay.
to lift it. Lifting, it's funny because I never really worked out prior. I'm 54 years old. I'm 54. Turned 54 just this past
You don't look
September.
a day over 53 there. So, I mean,
You know what? I get that all the time. It's just, the fountain of youth. I'm drinking from the fountain. It's the bourbon. That's what's doing it. Anyway,
that's it.
I never really had worked out much before, but back in Christmas of 2013, my family went down to Disney World for Christmas. We were literally in Magic Kingdom on Christmas Day. It was a lot of fun. But my daughter, who's now 17, at the time, she wanted to go see Beauty and the Beast.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a stage play. And so we go to see Beauty and the Beast. And, you get there on the stage and all the characters come out in their costumes. Well, the guy that plays Gaston comes out and he was not wearing a muscle suit. It was just a guy that was just yoked. I mean, he was just jacked. And, Gaston is the real conceited, kind of very full of himself. And so he comes out and, he's like, no one sings like Gaston and has biceps like Gaston. Anyway, and he comes out on stage and I'm sitting thinking to myself, my wife's looking at this guy stacked and rocked up there. And then she's looking at this toe sack of potatoes sitting next to her husband. So I thought, when I get back to Nashville, I've got to start the new year off. The way many people start off the new year, gym and Jesus. You got to make those two changes, right?
That's right.
So I go back and I join a gym here in Nashville, and I didn't know it at the time, but I signed up for the once a month plan because I went like once in January and twice in February. And then in March over spring break, we were in St. Louis, and the guy that managed the gym at the time calls me up and he says, hey, David, this is Jeff at the gym. He said, I've been looking at your attendance. You've been here 3 times since January. Man, you're pathetic. That's what he said. You're pathetic. He said, you need a trainer. I said, well, I can't afford a trainer, man. You're not going to get a trainer. He said, well, if you don't get a trainer, you're not going to stick with it. Trust me. So I came back, signed up for a package of 8 sessions with this guy. And I show up and this guy walks in. His name was Big Teal. And he was like this 6'3" black dude, tatted from head to toe, like, just money signs and pistols tattooed on him, all that, just, totally jacked. He comes up to me. He has a shirt on that says kicking your ass one step at a time. So he comes up to me and he says, hey, you ready? I said, yeah. He said, I just made 2 people throw up today. Why are you here? And I thought to myself at that point, I'm beginning to question it myself. But that was the first. There's a 30-minute session. 15 minutes into it, I was literally crying like a little girl, begging him, could we stop? 15 minutes in, he wouldn't let me. Finally, he saw I was about to pass out. He let me go splash some water on my face. But that was the beginning of a couple of months of just trying to get my endurance up. What I didn't know at the time, that was, really March, April of 2014. What I didn't know at the time that the Lord had kind of led me to start lifting and working out was that later that year, October of 2014, my mama was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and she lived another 8 months. And I really attribute me being able to just kind of keep it together during that time to the word and prayer and lifting. And I think lifting, honestly, in some ways saved my sanity, saved my, so I really do believe the word and prayer. C.S. Lewis, maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later, but C.S. Lewis and lifting. And so ever since then, I can't not do it. In fact, as soon as I'm finished with you, I'm going to GNC to get a little more nitrous oxide that I've run out of, and then I'm hitting the gym.
Dude,
a little more creatine. I've run out of that too.
Today's my leg day. I've similarly noticed I start to stress out real bad at night if I haven't lifted. trying to go to sleep and I'm not
Yeah,
tired enough, and all the stuff comes up to my head, and I just start to stress out. But it doesn't happen if I lift. And actually, this is funny, man. I was also inspired by Gaston. So as a kid,
it's hilarious.
as a kid, I looked at him and I knew that he was supposed to be the bad guy, but I was like, no one lifts like Gaston. No, all the
Yeah,
girls want Gaston. This dude is breaking belts with his neck. I want to be Gaston. And so,
absolutely.
started wrestling. I always wanted to be Gaston. And then I realized later, like, all right, man, I need to probably tone that Gaston attitude back. But yeah, that's hilarious that he was an inspiration for both of us.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I love Gaston. And the guy, here's the funny thing, the guy comes out, right? And he's he's just really stacked. I mean, really, really yoked up. And but like he would be in the park and guys would like go up to him and challenge him to push-up contests and stuff. And like as he walked around the park, as the other characters walk around the
Oh,
park.
nice.
Oh yeah, and there'd always be like some, like weekend warrior, 30-something-year-old dad want to come up and impress his daughter,
Right, right.
watch me take it. And the guy would just completely torch him. It was hilarious. So yeah, he was a real inspiration to me. But the thing is, going to the gym over the years, what I have found is, I mean, it's really become a significant part of who I am, right? I
Mhm.
don't know myself now apart from lifting. But it's been a real opportunity in the gym to walk with people. They find out that I'm a minister or a pastor or some kind of, religious guru or whatever
Right.
they perceive me to be. And it really affords me a front row seat in their lives oftentimes. And the opportunities I've had to truly to walk with people and minister to people in over the last 4 or 5, whatever it's been, 6 years, I guess, 6 years of lifting has been great. So,
I love that, man. That's so great. That's an encouragement for the folks at home, man. Especially if you're in a pastoral position or somewhere where you're just around Christians all the time, and go to a gym.
yeah.
Uh,
Oh, absolutely.
do that and be known as that guy. Be known as the pastor lifter dude who's like, yeah,
Yes.
someone comes to show up to lift, and their mom just passed away. They just got dumped, whatever, and they're like, hey, you're a pastor. What do I do with this? And
Yeah.
it's like, all right, well, let me finish this set, and we'll get in, we'll get into it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sweet.
It's a
Well,
great way to get out of the Christian bubble for sure.
right, right. So we've both been influenced by Gaston. We've also both been influenced by C.S. Lewis, which hopefully we can get into. But we've also been influenced by Cornelius Van Til. And I initially found your Instagram, saw you working on your dissertation, which was on Van Til and J. Oliver Buswell. And your dissertation is called "A Fountainhead of Misunderstanding: J. Oliver Buswell, Cornelius Van Til, and the Context and Contours of an Apologetic Debate." So I want to just jump in on that with the question, who is J. Oliver Buswell for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah. J. Oliver Buswell is one of the, godliest and in some ways most significant Presbyterian theologians and theological educators and administrators of last century that a lot of folks maybe haven't heard of, which is interesting because he was such a significant figure during the neo-evangelical period. And he comes from a ministerial family. His grandfather was a minister. His father was a minister. James Oliver himself became a minister in the PCUSA. He was a chaplain in during World War II and went on to become later the president of Wheaton College from
Hmm.
1926 to 1940. He was also the president of the NBI, the National Bible Institute, which later became Shelton College. And then, of course, in my dissertation, I talk about the transfer of that over to Carl McIntyre and that whole period. It was really kind of a big constant soap opera going on among several of those guys at the time. But then he also later becomes the dean, the academic dean and professor of theology for Covenant College and Covenant Theological Seminary. Covenant College moved from Pasadena, California to St. Louis in '56, and with that concurrently, Covenant Theological Seminary started. Then, of course, Covenant College moved to Chattanooga, where it is now, and Buswell remained there until his he was dean until I think it was like 1965. He remained teaching at Covenant Seminary until 1970. Ended up moving to Quarryville, to the Presbyterian retirement community there. He had a blood clot that they tried to do surgery on, and it resulted in him being on his left side, more or less paralyzed on the left side. And so
Wow.
he lived out his remaining years there. And Van Til, who had been for years, much at Buswell's sort of more aggressive initiative, kind of an epistemological, theological nemesis,
Mm-hmm.
would go up and visit, Buswell there at Quarryville, where he ultimately passed away in 1977. His dates were 1895 to 1977, and Van Til's dates were 1895 to 1987. So Buswell was, just a little over 4 months older than Van Til, died 10 years earlier than Van Til. So they were contemporaries, and yeah.
Well, that's so interesting. Just a quick note for my sake: is Covenant to PCA what like Westminster is to OPC?
Well, it's a great question. So, yes and no. Covenant is the national seminary. Covenant Theological Seminary is the national seminary of the Presbyterian Church in America. Westminster Theological Seminary is not denominationally affiliated. It is overseen by a private board that is
Oh,
comprised of ruling and teaching elders from the PCA and the OPC. President Peter Lilback, dear friend, very, very godly, good man, is a PCA teaching elder. The academic dean, another dear friend of mine, Dr. David Garner, is a PCA teaching elder. So there are a number of PCA teaching elders on staff and faculty, and OP teaching elders on staff and faculty. However, one of the reasons I think people associate Westminster and assume sometimes that maybe it's the denominational seminary of the
yeah.
OPC is that, of course, J. Gresham Machen founded both the
Mhm.
the seminary and the OPC. There's
Okay.
been a close relationship between Westminster and the OP for decades, but as well as the PCA
Okay. Yeah, that's really
and,
helpful.
and other denominations. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about being familiar with a lot of the Reformed seminaries. They serve a number of denominations, and if you go to any of the RTS campuses or Westminster or Covenant, you'll find a lot of PCA, ARP, OPC, Acts 29, Reformed Baptist, a little bit
Mhm.
of everything. Yeah.
Yeah, those are great schools, man. Uh, so how did you end up? Well, so I know Buswell because really only because of him coining presuppositionalism, and he
Yeah.
kind of used that in a derogatory way. In your dissertation, I found it in 1949. He kind of coined that
Mhm.
term against Van Til, and as the story goes, Van Til wasn't super excited about it, but just kind of went with it and said, "All right, that's what I'll call it." Uh, wh- why do you think that Buswell has kind of fallen out of the evangelical memory?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Given how significant Buswell was,
Hmm.
uh, what a key player he was last century in the neo-evangelical period. Why is it that when we go to seminary today, or when I interact with seminary candidates and so forth, they've never heard of Buswell, even though you've got a library named after him at Covenant, you got a library named after him at Wheaton College, and so forth. He had been a president there, again, from 26 to 40. Very significant theological educator and administrator. Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for why he's sort of fallen out of evangelical memory.
Hmm.
Before I answer, let me back up just to, he is the one who coined the term presuppositionalism. By his own admission, he picked up the idea from Alan McRae, who had coined, or who had described Van Til's approach as presuppositionism. Presuppositionism. He's trying to describe to Buswell, as Buswell was trying to make sense of Van Til's method, McCrae said, well, it's kind of a presuppositionism. So in the 1949 issue of November of the Bible Today, which is a magazine that Buswell edited. I mean, again, that's another example of how influential he was. He was an editor of a pretty significantly distributed, evangelical Reformed magazine at the time called the Bible Today. And so he had a couple of articles entitled "The Fountainhead of Presuppositionalism." He is the first person to use that term, which has become synonymous with Van Til, of Van Til's method, presuppositionalism. And as you said, it's not something that Van Til coined. It's not something that he made up to describe his own system. Van Til more usually spoke of his system as a transcendental approach, kind of that picking up on Kantian language there. But he went ahead and it stuck, right? Buswell intended it to be more of a derogatory, sort of a critical kind of term. And that was easy because Buswell ended up kind of building a straw man, not intentionally, I don't think at first, but a straw man version of some significant facets of Van Til's thought. And one was a misdefinition of presuppositionalism, or what Van Til meant by presupposition. Maybe we touch on that a little bit later. But as to why Buswell has fallen out of evangelical memory, I think a couple of things. One, as Reformed denominations, I think through the influence of biblical theology, kind of Vossian exegesis, etc., and others, and the influence of Westminster Seminary in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s even, as a more reformed types are becoming amillennial in their understanding of Revelation, the book of Revelation. Buswell was towing a fairly strident premillennial position, so I think that's one thing. He also had some quirky views here and there in his systematic theology. And because of that, his systematic theology was not reprinted and used regularly in Reformed seminary, say the way that Berkhoff was. Okay. And so I think the fact that here you have Buswell having written a full-orbed systematic. I mean, it's over here on my shelf. I mean, it's as full and thorough as Berkhoff's, but it didn't get reprinted. And I think for that reason, I think another thing too is he was not known as a powerful orator, and so you don't end up getting a lot of his sermons turned into books, which can extend a person's staying power. And then maybe another reason is because though he did teach, he was he was dean, academic dean, and professor of theology at Covenant. He did spend a good chunk of his career in theological educational administration. So he during the years that Van Til and Murray, for instance, were teaching and lecturing, he was also putting in a lot of hours as an educational administrator. That said, he is the one who I think really stirred things up with Van Til. Van Til was not the one pursuing Buswell. It was certainly Buswell who was pursuing Van Til. And that's kind of true to his character. And I found when I was working on the dissertation, I managed to find his high school yearbook from his senior year of high school. And they had their superlative awards like best dresser and all this kind of stuff. And he came in first place as most studious and second place as best fusser. So that skill and penchant he had for fussing, he took with him and pursued Van Til pretty hot and heavy. And much of the dissertation is, at least in the early part, is the history of that pursuit. And then I get into the philosophical, theological differences. But this whole issue, of epistemology was just so significant in those days. And I think that's something that that we don't realize when we think about the early part of last century, when we think about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s,
Mm-hmm.
how central a role epistemology played and debates over epistemology. We think it was just all the battle for the Bible. It was just all
Right.
issues of the fundamentals, and it was that. But I think because it was controversy over the fundamentals of the faith and a controversy, the battle for the Bible, questions of epistemology unavoidably rose to the top. And so you have significant figures like Buswell or Van Til or Gordon Clark
Yeah, Carl
or
Henry's up there.
Carl Henry.
Yep.
I think for me, honestly, the thing that I probably was the most rewarding discovery in my research for this was Carl. I mean, I've always known of Carl Henry, but I've never done a lot of serious work with Carl Henry.
Yeah.
And that for me was one of the most rewarding kind of deep dives, was having to get into Carl Henry, in part because of Carl Henry's deep respect for Van Til and
Mm-hmm.
Gordon Clark and all these guys at this time were really, really vitally concerned about questions of epistemology.
Yeah, I thought that's so interesting as I started studying this too. As I got into Van Til, as you know, as everyone who starts to study Van Til, he's so historically located that you have to start figuring some of the debates out in order to understand him better. Oh, why is he clarifying him? Why is he going at Schaeffer? I thought that was his student. And then you figure out why, and getting in deeper and deeper, I bought every book I could find on Carl Henry, and his name's here at TEDS, and I've never been assigned a Carl Henry book here at TEDS ever. And his name's,
Wow.
on our thing. And so, yeah, so I started reading him for myself, and then Greg Thornberry, he's got a book
Yeah.
on Henry, and he says,
It's a great little book. Yeah.
yeah, it's really good, and he talks about how exactly what you said. The last century, there was this huge debate over epistemology, and that we don't talk about that today. But in order to recover evangelicalism, that's got to be one of the aspects, is getting at an evangelical epistemology. And I thought that was so
Absolutely.
fantastic.
Absolutely. I think that, well, I guess anything can be overstated, but I don't think that can be it would be hard to overstate that. And that became apparent to me as I worked on the dissertation. The effort
Mm.
was to kind of historically set Van Til so that, because I really think, now obviously, I got my coffee mug out there. Van Til's my homeboy, and
Mhm.
so I'm a homer for Van Til. There's no question about it. But um, I think, given the cultural moment in which we find ourselves and the implications of this cultural moment for what I call the five pieces of the worldview puzzle, not that there aren't more than five pieces, but the five big pieces of the worldview puzzle: theology, anthropology, epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. I think Van Til is going to be increasingly heralded as
Mm.
more and more relevant in the years to come. And so, part of, I mean, there are different things that kind of led me into doing, admittedly, a rather niche dissertation.
Mhm.
But one of them is just my conviction of the relevance of Van Til, because of the relevance of epistemology. The relevance of epistemology in the neo-evangelical period, because of the battle of the Bible and so forth. Again, epistemology is always relevant, and
Yeah.
that's why, for instance, in Calvin's Institutes, Calvin begins as he does with epistemology. It's why, frankly, that the Westminster Confession of Faith, beginning as it does with the doctrine of Scripture, is making an epistemological move in so
Right.
doing.
Right.
And so these things are really important. But the historical setting helps us understand Van Til, because a lot of times people will try to read Van Til, and admittedly, it's not the clearest prose. He's not the most polished writer.
Mhm.
Many of the books that we have now are sort of updated syllabi, and it's just not great prose. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to defend him there. And so I think because of that, people check out. They'll try to read a few pages and they'll check out. But I think if you can understand his historical setting, you'll see why he's responding to certain figures, why he's using certain nomenclature. The I think easy sort of way to dismiss him as an idealist misses the fact that he's trying to use idealist nomenclature to apply a Christian worldview in that sort of philosophical milieu. But
Yeah.
he is difficult to read. There's no question. But man, he repays the reading.
Yeah, seriously. And something that I was able to get past the idealistic language quick because I came from ministry, and such an emphasis at that time in ministry was contextualization. And I thought
Right.
that's just what Van Til's doing. He's just contextualizing for his audience. His audience
Yeah.
are idealistic philosophers. And so,
Yes.
fine. I'll just jump in. I'll understand what he means by limiting concept and these kind of things. And then actually, it's not that bad of language when you start to understand what it is, and you go, "Oh, absolute personality is a great way to describe the Trinity." That's fantastic.
Yes. It's a fantastic way to describe the Trinity. And that's one of the areas that people, I think, who give him a superficial reading, very superficially dismiss him as on the doctrine of the Trinity. And I think, frankly, it's probably the area where he's made the most solidifying contribution to the Reformed theological conversation last century. But the idea of contextualization, and I think for me, well, I'll say this: that's one of the reasons why I think Buswell misunderstood Van Til. So Buswell calls Van Til the fountainhead of presuppositionalism. I entitled my dissertation "A Fountainhead of Misunderstanding" because Buswell
really nice.
he simply misunderstood Van Til, despite Van Til's patient efforts to explicate what he meant. Buswell was an exceedingly earnest and godly man, an exceedingly earnest, godly, learned man. But he seemed, I think, early on, not able to understand Van Til. And then I have to say, I think it reached a point where he simply wasn't willing, because you read Van Til's responses, and I mean, I'm not as dumb as I look. Even I can understand what Van Til was trying to say.
Right.
And that Buswell never seemed to be able to do it makes me wonder, was he actually willing to do it? There was a lot of kind of jockeying for position among those guys in the neo-evangelical period. And I think it maybe didn't, appeal to their better angels at times. But so there's that. But for me, contextualization, I was able to appreciate Van Til's contextualization because before I decided to go this route with my dissertation, everything that I had been doing, everything that I had been doing was toward the life and theology of Jonathan Edwards. And so I teach a course on Edwards for Westminster now, and I teach a course for on Edwards theology for RTS. And so everything had been about Edwards. And that's exactly what Jonathan Edwards is doing. And it's one of the reasons why I think people find it easy to very superficially dismiss Edwards, because Edwards, he wasn't trying to contextualize in an idealist moment, but rather the transatlantic context of kind of post-Enlightenment, deism as Enlightenment religion, Historia Humana as Enlightenment historiography, the British moral sense school, in terms of Enlightenment ethics. And so much of what Edwards is doing, preaching, writing, etc., was a constant contextualized apologetic, utilizing the language of Lockean sense perception, and in an effort to communicate in a way that people were thinking and hearing public discourse.
Yeah, that's so helpful, and I think about that for us as well. This is something that gets me so excited. I think you're absolutely right that Van Til will become more relevant, and I think a big part of that is because we're downstream now of like New Calvinism, as they called it a couple years back, and I was a part of that. I drink IPAs. I have a handlebar mustache. Like that. I was brought in on that. My brother was too.
I love it.
Like we have our thumb on the pulse here, because it was a big part of us. I'm wearing a shirt right now. It says certified cage-free Calvinist.
You are, man.
I'm past the cage stage, right? So a lot of us are we started with John Piper, and we said, I want to read who John Piper reads. And so I bought all the whole Owen set on eBay. got all Calvin's commentaries, Edwards, everyone. And we start reading that, and then we say, well, I need to take this out to my college campus, and okay, I need some apologetics, and we get into Van Til. And then what's so cool now is, as we're reading through this, it takes a long time, but years and years have gone by, and now we're saying, who is Van Til the theologian? What is this absolute personality that I kind of had to hide from when I was doing apologetics? But now I understand, he's at the center of his stuff. So we're getting into his theology. What did Van Til really say about Karl Barth? Now we're getting into his theology. And we're starting to see that he's not just an apologist. The guy, got his PhD in philosophy. He's a theologian. And I think there's a lot more there too than just, an apologist. And really on the popular level, a misunderstanding, I think, big time of Van Til, the apologist anyways. So I'm excited, man. That's why I love to have this conversation with you right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think if we only approach Van Til as an apologist, not only do we miss him as a theologian, we misunderstand him as an apologist, because he did not see an undue bifurcation between theology and apologetics. For him, apologetics was the explication of theology. And I'll go so far as to say, this. Now, people are going to disagree with me and write me off as a homer for Van Til. That's fine. I think the most important theologian of last century has to be Karl Barth, in terms of his impact and the fact that it was such a pervasive, permeating, programmatic paradigm shift. There's 4 P's in a row there.
Yeah, you sure you're not Baptist there? Holy cow.
Yeah, there you go. That'll preach, brother. That'll preach right there. He was so significant, right? And important in terms of his impact, right? In terms of his impact across, transcontinental, transdenominational, and even as you talk about the Young, Restless, and Reform kind of movement, building around Piper and others in the early 2000s. At the same time, there was a renaissance of Barth among the sort of post-evangelical, post-conservative, post-evangelical emergent types.
Yeah, the emergent folks,
and so Barth, that said, while I think he is the most important in terms of his impact, I actually think the greatest theologian of last century was Van Til, in terms of his thoroughgoing program, his thoroughgoingly Trinitarian theological program, that with in back of him assuming, though not explicating it himself, but building upon a Vossian biblical theological heritage. I think what Van Til did is absolutely crucial. And I think that's why it's going to be so relevant moving forward. And so what people have to do, I always tell people, they say, well, should I read, Christian apologetics? Yeah. Should I read Defense of the Faith? Yeah. But you really should read Introduction to Systematic Theology.
Yes. It's my favorite book by him. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's mine too.
Yeah.
I think it's mine too. I think I shifted during the dissertation, and I think Common Grace and the Gospel started to be the one that I thought, this may be the most important, but I think it's Introduction to Systematic Theology.
Yeah. Same. Common Grace is so good. You get his philosophy of history. But I love his stuff on facts. And again, talking about C.S. Lewis, that's their understanding of facts come together. I picked that up from John Frame and then followed it out. And Frame's right. All right. Yeah, they're totally right there.
Lewis. And here's the crazy thing: people think okay, so people who are in the know, they know that I wrote on Van Til and so forth, but they see my deep love for Lewis, and they're like, how can that be? Because admittedly, right, Van Til was not a huge fan of Lewis. In fact, he was the one who said that Lewis's theology was an inkling. He thought he was really proud of that little jab that Lewis's theology was an inkling. Well, C.S. Lewis had some theological quirks. We all know that. He was not trained theologian and philosopher that Van Til was, but I don't know where I'd be without C.S. Lewis. And I honestly, at the existential level, maybe not on paper, but at the existential level, I find their apologetics dovetailing quite nicely. And I'm not buying into the I'm not suggesting that somehow an unvarnished, classical apologetic, is no different from a covenantal apologetic,
Right.
obviously.
Right.
But when you read Lewis carefully and you go beyond what I call the C.S. Lewis dirty dozen, which are the typical quotations that say in my own denomination, the PCA, that PCA pastors. Here's the thing: I'm not that convinced that many people read deeply into C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that they hear Tim Keller quote or John Piper quote C.S. Lewis, and then they hear somebody else quote John Piper and Tim Keller, and then they pick up on those quotes, and the what I call the dirty dozen quotations of C.S. Lewis wind up in sermons in PCA pulpits. But when you read Lewis much more deeply, you're going to find that he really is doing in a what we might call a presuppositional way.
Yeah.
He is undermining naturalistic presuppositions in a way that I think Van Til would cheer on.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm writing a paper for Dr. Van Hooser in a reading class I have with him this semester. I think I might title it like a Van Tillian reading of Miracles or something like that,
Oh
because
wow!
it's fun, man. In Miracles, Lewis starts chapter 1 with presuppositions and the importance of presuppositions, and it's basically the same line as Van Til. Van Til says, I'm cool talking about other stuff, facts, and more facts, but I wouldn't keep going facts, and more facts without challenging the unbeliever's philosophy of fact. And Lewis says almost the word for word the same thing in Miracles. And then chapter 2, he goes over 1 or 2. There's a worldview that says 1, that's pantheism, that's materialism, or there's 2, theism. Then 3 is a transcendental refutation of naturalism, materialism, and then 4 is a transcendental argument for theism, which is sweet. And then he goes into facts. So I'm still working it out. But
I'd love to see your paper when you're done with it. That's great.
It'll be fun. We'll see.
Well, when Lewis famously challenges a naturalistic materialist epistemology, the idea that thoughts are just chemical reactions, then you have no reason to trust your thoughts, that your thoughts are just chemical reactions, right? He's without saying it, I think, arguing presuppositionally, but even more, he is imbibing an epistemological, kind of an epistemological elixir that Van Til would readily serve up. And I don't think you can find in C.S. Lewis a commitment to brute facts that you would find in your typical evidential or classical apologist. I just don't see that it's there. I believe in the rising of the sun, not because I see it, but by it I see everything else. Same reason I believe in Christianity. So I'm really at home with both Van Til and Lewis. And honestly, I'll just tell you personally, when I was walking through my mama's sickness and her eventual death, I'll never forget coming into my study, and it was about a month before she died, and it became clear to us that nothing was working, the treatment wasn't working, that there were no other options, and it was just clear to our family that medically this had turned a corner, nothing we were going to be able to do. And I just picked up an old, tattered, dog-eared little cheap paperback off my shelf of A Grief Observed, and I'll never forget opening it up, where Lewis says, no one ever told me grief feels so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is the same. And here you have this most eloquent of all writers, almost like in a stream of consciousness, saying, I keep on fidgeting, I cough, I keep swallowing, I'm smoking too much, and I'll never forget when he says, because he's writing, of course, in reflection on Joy Davidman's death, but he says, people say, come on, a little time, we'll make it go away, and it's not so bad, you'll get along fine in a matter of time. And then he says, and then I'll never forget, then comes a sudden red hot jab of memory, and all of that common sense vanishes like a moth in the mouth of a furnace. And I remember reading that thinking, okay, he has just put lyrics to the sad music I'm hearing. And so, yeah, I don't know where I'd be without
Wow.
Lewis or Van Til.
Yeah, dude, praise God. We could go like all day on this the connections that we have with this stuff. So
Yes.
fantastic, man. I wanna get back to your work particularly as we're running out of time here. But
Hmm.
you say that dude, thanks so much for sharing about your mom, by the way, too. I don't want to just rush off and
Yeah.
oh yeah. So anyways, back to this. That's
Yeah.
really awesome, man. I appreciate you being open and sharing with that.
Hey,
Um,
man, I believe the gospel, and I believe in the resurrection of the
amen,
dead. And
dude.
and here's here's one of the ways that Van Til's helped me.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that Edwards and Van Til and Lewis have helped me, and maybe Van Til as much or more than any of them.
Hmm.
I see everything theologically. I see everything through the reality of the finished work of Christ, as I know you do too.
Yeah.
But it was Van Til who, in many ways, right, C.S. Lewis makes me want to see everything
Hmm.
through the lens of Christ. Edwards gives me an example of somebody who clearly did. Van Til gives me epistemological justification.
Wow.
That's how I feel about the three of them.
Wow, man. That's really
Yeah,
helpful. That's so cool. Yeah, I love that. That's a great way of putting it. There's not a great transition here, so I'm just gonna go
let's just
back.
go.
Yeah, so Buswell, your dissertation here on Buswell and Van Til. You talked about misunderstandings, four basic contours, four basic misunderstandings that Boswell had of Van Til's thought, and you said they're presupposition. He misunderstood Van Til on presupposition, on paradox, on creation, and on common ground. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure how to proceed here. Do you can you do you want to explain maybe Van Til on those four, or how Boswell misunderstood? I mean, you wrote it, so
Yeah, it's hard to say. How do you begin? Do you begin by looking at Van Til's what Van Til meant by those four
right.
things, or do you begin by looking at how Buswell I think misunderstood him in those four things, and then move to Van Til? I guess it's six one half dozen the other. On the
Yeah,
one hand, it may be better to begin with Buswell because probably his misunderstanding of Van Til may be broadly representative of
yeah,
what people think. For
yeah,
instance,
yeah.
presupposition. So Buswell coined the term presuppositionalism,
Mm-hmm.
and he foisted that upon Van Til. Then he proceeded to define what what presuppositionalism means, and would never let Van Til describe it otherwise. Would never let Van Til correct,
Hmm.
which was an interesting thing. So if Buswell is saying you're a presuppositionalist, and here's what presuppositionalism is,
Yeah,
and Van Til says, well, if I'm the fountainhead of presuppositionalism, shouldn't I be allowed to define what a presupposition is and what presuppositionalism is? Buswell was never willing to allow him to do that. As you know, I think that's probably a fairly common uh, misunderstanding of what presuppositionalism is. People think, like Buswell, that presuppositionalism or being a presuppositionalist simply means that you approach apologetics from the standpoint that everybody has presuppositions.
hmm,
Well, that's such a woefully superficial and frankly naive understanding of what Van Til meant by it. Of course, everybody has presuppositions. You don't have to be a Van Tilian to operate apologetically along the lines of everybody having presuppositions. We all know that.
yeah.
Buswell, of course, insisted on that as a definition, but for him, for Buswell, a presupposition in Van Til's, uh, the way he viewed Van Til was that um, that, and this is the thing, and this is important because it was Greg Bonson who described this as the quote linguistic key to their miscommunication.
Hmm.
And just as a little aside, and at some point, I guess we can even talk about what got me into doing this study to begin with.
Yeah.
But when I first got into this, I would say there may have been between Bonson and Frame and maybe a couple of articles, there might have been, and then a couple of a couple of paragraphs in Meether's biography of Van Til, there might have been a page worth of material on this debate, which is one of the reasons I knew it needed to be addressed, because everybody knows of the Clark-Van Til controversy and the implications of that in the OPC back in the day, but nobody knows of this debate. So that's why I knew I had to. Plus, I stumbled on a whole bunch of unpublished correspondence between them, and anyway, it's a really fun story. But the definition of presupposition, Greg Bahnsen calls it the linguistic key to their miscommunication. And Buswell writes, and I quote, "In what sense do we students of theology presuppose our basic presupposition? There may be many answers to this question, but only one answer is necessary for our procedure. We take our presupposition as a conclusion arrived at on the basis of what we consider good and sufficient reasons." So, for Buswell, we all have presuppositions, and our starting point is what we have observed and verified and found substantiated by good and sufficient reasons, evidences, reason, experience, etc. Van Til was saying, by presuppositionalism, if that's what you're going to call me, or what I'm calling a transcendental approach, I want to ask, what is the atmosphere or preconditions for something to even be sufficiently reasonable? And that was really, the difference between them. And, Buswell never allowed Van Til to define presuppositionalism. In fact, Buswell leaned on a guy named E.J. Carnell. Now, some of your listeners may be familiar with Edward J. Carnell, and he had been a student of Van Til, but had deviated and sadly lived a pretty tragic life. But in his Introduction to Christian Apologetics, Buswell considered that the best book on presuppositional apologetics that had ever been written. But his definition of presupposition and presuppositionalism was not the same thing that Van Til was arguing.
Carnell was also a student of Clark, right?
Yes.
And so he's kind of got, a Clarkian understanding as well as some Van Til in there, but really sided more with Clark and kind of the axiomatic approach of a presupposition. It's my chosen starting point, and then I'll make sense of the rest of my axioms or my system based on my axiom that I've chosen. And I think Schaeffer might kind of go that route too, though I think he's a little inconsistent.
So. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Parker. That is very well said. I agree about Schaeffer, because everybody said, well, because Schaeffer had said, after the line of despair, was it 25 in Europe and maybe it was 39 in America. He said presuppositionalism or presuppositional apologetics would have stopped the decay. Well, of course, Schaeffer had been a student of Van Til, but you're right. I think you have more of a subjective, because what you're just describing there, that axiomatic approach, is more of a subjective rather than an epistemologically, metaphysically necessary principium. So for Van Til, presuppositionalism, if that's what we're going to let Buswell call it, to argue transcendentally is asking what are the necessary, unavoidable principia. So the principium ascendi is the triune God of the Bible. The principium cognoscendi externum is the Bible of the triune God. So what you have is an irrefutable, unavoidable, inescapable, necessary, objectively necessary principium, rather than what Carnell and Clark and Schaeffer to some degree, though praise God for all of them, and especially for Schaeffer, because who knows how many people, we will walk alongside the new heaven, new earth because of the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. But it was more of that subjective thing. And in that sense, I think is right similar to kind of Plantinga's idea of warranted Christian belief. It's at the end of the day, it ends up being subjective. And that's the last thing that Van Til was going to was going to, countenance.
I think that's so true. I think that's so right, and that the language of subjective and objective I picked up from James Anderson, I think maybe one of his lectures, and I think it's so helpful because what many people think, and Buswell apparently as well, when you talk about presuppositional apologetics, they think, oh, you're just saying I'm assuming Christianity, and then I'm proving the rest of Christianity by my assumption. And you're saying, well, no, actually, take your subjective presupposition, whatever it is, and I'm asking you, what are the necessary preconditions of you having any subjective presupposition at all? So you have your system, whatever. I'm talking deeper. I'm talking for you to be able to think what must be true. For you to be able to reason at all, what must the universe be like in order for that to take place? And it's a Christian universe.
Absolutely. Which gets into the idea why an assumption cannot simply be a supposition about a random fact, because
right.
there is no randomness, there is no random brute factness, if I can say it that way, because we are looking at the overarching epistemological metaphysical atmosphere that makes intelligibility possible. So Van Til, of course, as Bahnsen, was always famous to say, and ended up wiping up the floor with Gordon Stein in the famous debate back in '85, saying, we're arguing for the Christian worldview, which alone can account for the requisites of intelligibility, right? The laws of logic, the laws of induction upon which science depends, the laws of deduction upon which mathematics depends, normativity of nature upon which scientific inquiry begins, objectivity and predication upon which linguistics depend, morality, personhood, on and on and on, right? You know how this goes. And so that's not, and that's why I think Bahnsen rightly said this definition of presupposition that Buswell had was the key to their linguistic miscommunication.
Yeah.
I have a section here that I think, and if you don't mind, I'll just read it very quickly here.
Please.
Where Van Til says something in a survey of a Christian epistemology that I think is helpful. So I said that Buswell could speak of his presupposition and commend that presupposition to students of theology as a, quote, conclusion arrived at on the basis of what we consider good and sufficient reasons, is a clue that he and Van Til were miscommunicating at the most basic definitional level. What did Buswell understand by presupposition and hence presuppositionalism? He flattened the concept, saying, the philosophy of Christian evidences, which I am advocating, does not differ from presuppositionalism in that I am ever willing to admit or assume anything whatsoever contrary to Christian theism, except in the well-known logical form of an admission for the sake of the argument. Assumption appears to be the key. Perhaps this is where I'm writing. Assumption appears to be the key, perhaps part and parcel of his understanding of what presupposition means in the context of the current debate. That this was a naive, simplistic definition on Buswell's part, and that Van Til was never operating on the definition of presupposition as assumption of a particular random fact, as though all facts are equal, hence not culpable of simplistic circular reasoning, is seen in a survey of a Christian epistemology. Here's Van Til. The charge is made that we engage in circular reasoning. Now, if it be called circular reasoning, we hold it necessary to presuppose the existence of God. We are not ashamed of it because we are firmly convinced that all forms of reasoning that leave God out of account will end in ruin. We hold that our reasoning cannot fairly be called circular reasoning because we are not reasoning about and seeking to explain facts by assuming the existence and meaning of certain other facts on the same level of being with the facts we are investigating, and then explaining these facts in turn by the facts with which we began. We are presupposing God, not merely another fact of the universe. And that's key, right? Yeah. If God is to come into contact with us at all, it is natural that the initiative must be with him. And this will also apply to the very question about the relation of God to us. Accordingly, it is only by God's own testimony that we can know anything about him. So that gets into what I was saying earlier there, the idea of principia. Principium essendi, the triune God of the Bible, principium cognoscendi externum, the Bible of the triune God, are not just other facts that can be weighed and measured like any other supposedly brute fact that autonomous reason must assess and weigh and measure. And that's where, oddly enough, Buswell, here's the thing about Buswell. Buswell actually, he published a number of things, and the only thing that's really still in print by Buswell today is the systematic theology. And there is a Korean publisher, and they're called Westminster Publishers, and they're out of Korea, that back in the mid-90s published his systematic theology. But he wrote a number of other things, problems of the prayer life, and a piece on the atonement, some more pastoral pieces. Of everything that Buswell did, he spent a great deal of his time as a theological educational administrator.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to be known as a philosophical theologian. And of course, it was Buswell who criticized Jonathan Edwards and said, as a philosophical theologian, it would have been better had Edwards never spoken, because he charges Edwards with pantheism because of Edwards' doctrine of continued creationism. Buswell was always, his radar was always attenuated for pantheism. And that was his kind of go-to sort of label, that if he didn't understand what you were doing, you were in danger of pantheism, or you were in danger of Hegelianism. And of course, that was his criticism of Van Til. He wanted to be known as a philosophical theologian. That said, how he could read a statement like this by Van Til, among so many others, and I probably ought to say something about some of the format of how I got into the study, but he read so much of what Van Til was saying, but was never able to understand how Van Til was differing from the definitions that he, Buswell, was foisting upon Van Til, and would not let Van Til wriggle out of the sort of, dare I say it, presupposed definitions that he was trying to force on Van Til. And it wasn't just reading published things like this. I mean, what got me into the study to begin with was I went to the PCA Historical Center in St. Louis. My friend there, Wayne Sparkman, who does a wonderful job running the Historical Center. I was just there. We were up visiting Diane's parents in St. Louis, where they still live. And I went and said, do you have any of Schaeffer's papers here? Because, the Schaeffer Institute's there at Covenant. And he said, well, we only have a couple of letters. We don't have any of Schaeffer's papers. He said, we do have some other things you might be interested in. He said, we have a letter here between Van Til and Buswell, a couple of 3 letters between them, and some other material. Well, I started digging, and sure enough, there were these letters back and forth between Buswell and Van Til. But what really told me I might be onto something for a paper, like an independent study, which I ended up doing with Bill Edgar, was syllabi that back in those days, they would sort of mimeograph syllabi and mail them back and forth to each other.
Yeah.
And they would make marginalia in the syllabi. They would make notes or comments or questions in each other's syllabi and then send them back, because there was no email, there was no texting, right? There was not this kind of thing. And that's what they had to do. So I go up to Westminster and I start rooting around in the archives there, and just hit a juggernaut of materials that had never seen the light of day ever. And I knew, okay, I've got to move on from Edwards and focus on it, because nothing's ever been written on this. And I knew that I was onto something. And so I just found stacks of letters between Van Til and Buswell, stacks of syllabi back and forth with all kinds of marginalia. Then I ended up, I did a paper for Edgar, set it aside to finish coursework and languages and comps and all that. Then I returned to this knowing that this was going to be the dissertation, was up there and ended up rooting around in the archives. And I found over here, just a corner of my eye, because I'd gone in, and Grace Mullen, who is no longer with us, she's with the Lord in glory now, but she was the archivist there. I'd asked if I could go in and just, for the heck of it, play around with Van Til's Barth's dogmatics in German.
Yeah.
I just wanted to,
I think I saw that on Instagram, actually.
Yeah, I posted it. Yeah. But while we were in there and she was letting me do that, she was struggling with cancer, and she couldn't get, she was pretty frail. She couldn't get that big volume back on the top shelf. She said, can you put that up there for me? So I grabbed it and I started to put it up, and when I turned, I looked out of the corner of my eye and I saw this Pepto-Bismol pink dust jacket, and I knew, and these were Van Til's books. And I knew right then I had hit the mother lode. It was Van Til's personal copy of J. Oliver Buswell's Systematic Theology. And I opened it up, and it was full of marginalia in all the right places.
Yeah.
Then Dr. Richard Gaffin let me borrow Van Til's personal copy of Herman Bavinck's Gearreform Dogmatik in the Dutch, and it was full of marginalia. And so a lot of this stuff was just ferreting out, as my advisor, Scott Oliphant, said, it was kind of an archaeological dig,
Yeah.
a lot of unpublished things. And I'll say this and stop rambling so much, but I recently was up there and went back down into the archives and discovered, and hopefully I'll be able to get an article written on this before somebody hears what I'm about to say and runs and jumps on it. But that's fine. It's all the Lord's kingdom anyway. But
Yeah.
I actually came across Van Til's personal copy of Immanuel Kant's critique.
No way.
And yeah, way. And no one knew it was there.
Wow.
It had not been touched since Van Til passed away, and it's full of his marginalia. Man. So I'm going to work on an article. If I could have found that when I did the dissertation, it would have added another 50 pages that I was already over word count. I had to trim it back anyway. But I want to do an article on Van Til's reading of Kant, drawn not just from Van Til's published corpus, but his actual real-time reading with his marginalia and his notes and all that. So that's the kind of stuff I geek out on.
That's so awesome. I wrote a paper on Lewis and Van Til, their view of facts, and I went over to the Wade Center here at Wheaton College, and they let me look at Lewis's marginalia, and I was so stoked about it. And I looked at his copies of Kant, and there was like hardly anything. I was so disappointed because it's a whole process. They got to go down and get the books out, and they put on a thing for you. And I was looking through, and it was nothing. So to find that Van Til, are you able to read his notes pretty well? Did he have good handwriting or?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Let me grab something here. So I'll say this, then I'm going to grab something.
Yeah.
I know you're thinking this guy's crazy. I am very much like Diane will tell you that I'm very like squirrel. Remember from Up? I'm just like, all over the place. But I'll send you all of my scans of Van Til's copy of Kant, and I'll just put them in a folder and send them to you, and you can see just how much he interacted with Kant.
Yeah.
But check this out. So hang on here. Let me grab this. And then I also scanned, and I'm gonna work on kind of an indexed reference, because I worked so thoroughly with Van Til's personal copy of Bavinck.
Yeah.
I want to put together some accessible kind of database of all of his references. I mean, some of this you can find in my dissertation, but all of the pages in his original copy of Bavinck, the page number, its correspondence to the New Baker set, the New English translation, and then what Van Til's actual comments were. And that may help future researchers,
That's going to help me, man. I want to write on that. Did he write in English in the Bavinck books?
By and large, yes. But occasionally he'll whip out the Dutch and make you work for it.
Yeah.
So this will give you an idea here. This is a copy of his apologetics syllabus.
Oh, sweet.
And there is his autograph there from 1976.
That's really nice. Look at that.
You can see this. Okay. So that's 1976. Then here is a first edition of the New Modernism, which is just a really important book that doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yep.
I think in some ways, in Van Til's corpus, the New Modernism and his work, Christianity and Bardianism, though not the easiest things, they are very, very important. But this is one that he autographed much later in life, and you can see his handwriting is starting to get shaky and little less legible. Whereas in 76 there was quite a little bit more of a flourish. And so I have read, to my knowledge, every single letter that he wrote. We're talking thousands of letters. To my knowledge, I've read every single one of them. I've been doing it for years, and all of his handwritten stuff, his typed stuff, etc. It's pretty legible. Now, he employed his own unique little abbreviations for things, but it's a lot of
Sure.
fun too, because like, there's a place where in Buswell's systematic theology, where Buswell says, that greatest of all Reformed theologians, B.B. Warfield, and in the margin, Van Til writes, apparently you've never heard of Bavinck, So he does these little cheeky jabs in the marginalia as well.
That's fantastic.
And Buswell, of course, Buswell would say that Hodge and Warfield were the greatest, and they were great, right? I mean, I'm working on my BB Warfield right here. This is trying to get my Warfield on.
Yeah.
BB Warfield was not, for our listeners, BB Warfield was not a great blues guitar player. He was an early theologian at Old Princeton. Anyway, real proud of that joke. I use it all the time.
That's
And
a good one. I
anyway,
like it.
not too bad, right? But but Buswell did not have a thoroughgoingly formal Reformed theological education. He was in many ways an autodidact. And so he didn't go to a Reformed seminary and get the full course of study.
Yeah.
So for Buswell, the majority of his truly Reformed underpinnings would have been his own reading of Calvin, his reading of Hodge's systematic theology, and certain pieces of Warfield. And while there were other things, that was about it. That was the main, sort of foundation of traditional Reformed theological training that he would have had. And that's part of what made the discussion between him and Van Til difficult, because he showed virtually no accessibility to the Dutch Reformed tradition. And I think that's part of what led him not only to misunderstand Van Til, as we've said, on presupposition, but paradox in the Trinity, where for him, he couldn't understand that when Van Til spoke of the absolute personality of God, and he would use the language of paradox, that he didn't intend contradiction.
Right.
And that's why Buswell said to Van Til, you don't realize it, but look at your feet. They are mired in Hegelian mud. And you are living with this whole dialectic, and basically accused Van Til of being Hegelian and Barthian and contradictory, and without even realizing it, a dialectical theologian.
Yeah.
And,
well, I wonder how much. So I believe I'm pretty sure my dates are right, that Clark was the philosophy professor at Wheaton when Boswell was the president, and then
indeed. Yeah.
Okay, and Clark taught that next generation that became like the neo-evangelical heroes, like
Yep.
Henry, and even like Billy Graham was in his class, which is crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I wonder how much Boswell is getting from Clark's understanding of presuppositionalism and Clark's critique, calling, Clark, what would he say? A paradox is like a Charlie horse between the ears or something, like just no time for it.
Yeah, I have that in the dissertation.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's very astute on your part. I actually got to see Gordon Clark's handwritten application for employment that he sent to Buswell while he was at Wheaton, where he promised him that he doesn't smoke cigarettes, because that was a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And but so Clark taught philosophy, and as much as Buswell considered himself a philosophical theologian, now bear in mind he did his work on John Dewey, and so he was a philosophically oriented scholar. There's no question about it. But I do believe that it was Clark who built upon an already present apprehension that Buswell had toward Van Til, and influenced it, from there. And so I think that contributed to Van Til trying to say, what I mean by paradox is the theological concept of mystery, not contradiction.
Right.
But for Buswell, if you use language that was the same nomenclature that you would find in Hegel, or the same nomenclature that you would find in idealist philosophers, you were an idealist. You were dialectical. For Van Til, for Buswell, a paradox was a contradiction,
Yeah.
plain and simple.
Yeah.
And he couldn't understand why people couldn't see that Van Til was just trafficking in contradiction.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that happens in every generation too. It's so frustrating when, someone I've learned a ton from, Dr. Van Hooser here. He's the first reader for my thesis. I don't agree with him on his Bart stuff probably, but he would eat my lunch if we went to the mat on it. But he likes Bart way more than I do. I'm more Van Tillian than he is. But the same thing happened with him when he started talking about speech act theory, and all
Right.
the older generation just started hammering him and saying, you're
Exactly.
compromising the faith. You are at this time it was a subjectivist or postmodernist or something, right? And he's postmodern theology, and yes, we need to be careful for sure. But I just see that trend coming up over and over, and it stinks because it seems like we're not listening to each other, or maybe the next generation as much. But
we read labels. We read
Yes,
labels. We don't
yes.
read. We don't read. We read labels. We don't read content. So yeah, that's a fine example. And I remember, speech act theory in the early days, his Dr. Van Hooser's work, and the criticisms that I think were and are superficial.
Yeah. Well, and coming from like Carl Henry, and at this time he's later in his career, his brain's not as sharp as it was, and yeah, like you said, it's a little bit more superficial. I've read the some of the back and forth there, and I don't want to divulge Van Hooser's personal stories. He's got some pretty funny ones.
I'm sure.
But what's interesting about Van Til and the Boswell thing is that Van Til was just with his transcendental language. Like he's got this quote about a transcendent God and a transcendental argument go hand in hand. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the principium. He's just putting the principium into transcendental language, and then transcendence, which really, that's fine. That's a theological term, but those two go together, and that makes sense. And if you were more, and maybe it's not Boswell's fault because Bavinck was still trapped in the Dutch back then. Probably most of it. I think he had a couple things maybe had been translated, but if he had been aware of that more, it would have been more obvious that Van Til's not trying to be revolutionary. He's trying to just bring the good old Dutch and Reformed tradition into modern language and then into philosophy and apologetics. And I think he did a great job of it. As I'm reading Bavinck more, and I think, again, like you said, I think Van Til is going to become more relevant. And I think because of like the generation of young, restless, and reformed growing, but also because the Bavinck revolution or Reformation, it's so similar, man. As I read more and more Bavinck, I'm like, yep, that's where Van Til got it from. Oh, Van Til's changed a little bit here and there, but that's pretty much what he's saying. And it's just fantastic. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, you're right. So it's going to be in part because of the Bavinck Renaissance. I think another reason that we're going to find Van Til becoming more relevant among guys from your generation who, cut their teeth on Piper and Edwards, praise God, and are going to be willing now to say, okay, tell me about Van Til. What, is he going to be useful for me to kind of bring into? I tell, when I teach a seminary, I tell my students, I say, you're going to need traveling partners because ministry is hard. It's David Martin Lloyd-Jones who said that in order to be a minister, a man has to have the mind of a scholar, the heart of a child, and the hide of a rhinoceros. I say it's going to be lonely. It's going to be hard. So you need traveling partners. Well, I think to your point here, for the aging, young, restless, and reformed generation, they're going to need traveling partners. You're going to need to add some traveling partners. I think Bavinck's going to be one of them. I think Van Til's going to be one of them because of the cultural moment in which we find ourselves with intersectionality and critical theory and the metaphysical implications of that for anthropology. And I think Van Til offers a truly Christian metaphysic that is going to enable us to interact and minister in this cultural moment with the metaphysical implications of critical theory.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And what's been so helpful and fruitful for me, I'm definitely more on the philosophical side of the Van Til camp. I know it's kind of splitting a little bit, but thank God everyone seems to still be charitable with each other nowadays. Not like maybe in the early days, the different Van Tilian interpreters. But what I've found so helpful for me personally is the transcendental presuppositionalism of Van Til. It pits you against modernism. It pits you against someone who says, we need to get past our presuppositions and just get to objective reality. And it's like, well, that's kind of naive actually. But it also pits you against and it pits you against the postmoderns who say, well, we're trapped in this. Everyone has their own presuppositions, and kind of like following like Thomas Kuhn and the subjectivism that follows from a certain interpretation of him. And you say, no, there is an objective set of presuppositions that make sense of the world. And so both of you guys, your critiques of each other are right. But then you just explode each other. No, come on over here to the Christian side where you can recognize presuppositions, but you also recognize that there's a right set of interpretation. There's a right interpretation of reality, and it's God's, and he's given it to, and we're the reinterpreters.
Yes. So analogous thinking, right?
Exactly.
Okay, Parker, you've nailed it. You have nailed it. What you were talking about here is Van Til's doctrine of analogy, which is different, of course, from Thomas's doctrine of analogy, which would be a whole other discussion that would take us, an hour to sort through probably. But analogous thinking, that we think our thoughts after God, our thoughts are images of God's thoughts. That's what saves us, whether it's objectivists or postmodernists. We've got to get beyond our presuppositions, or we're trapped in our cultural presuppositions and which is at the heart of critical theory.
Yep.
Van Til was ahead of that by saying anything other than a Christian metaphysic is and a Christian epistemology is going to leave you ping-ponging between irrationality and rationalism.
Yep.
And back and forth. The
dialectic.
Yeah. So that's why that you just said why I think he is going to become increasingly relevant. And in recent years, like the last 4 or 5 years, it's been popular in scholarly literature and online theological, blogs and that kind of thing to kind of pile on and sort of make Van Til a whipping boy. I mean, you've seen that. I'm just going to go ahead and say you've seen it. You've seen it with Paul Helm. You've seen it with Richard Muller, who praise God for both of these incredible scholars. And I'm not worthy to carry their briefcase, but you also see it. You've seen it with Keith Matheson down at Ligonier, or J.V. Fesco's most recent book, Reforming Apologetics. And though I'm thankful to God for all these brothers and their tremendous scholarship and benefit to the kingdom of God, I wonder, honestly, and this sounds disrespectful and I don't mean to be, but have they actually read Van Til deeply and widely? Because I don't recognize Van Til in their critiques.
Yeah.
And I certainly think that it's going to be important for those of us who appreciate Van Til to start writing and thinking and doing what we're doing here to try to get people to realize his relevance and to pick him up. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the dissertation. And frankly, I guess the rest of my life, however long the Lord gives me breath, is going to be devoted toward, an explication at the scholarly and street level, both of Van Tilian corpus and epistemology.
Yeah. Well, amen, man. And I feel the same way. And it's because it's not out of a slavish duty. I do feel some sort of duty to him because people misrepresent him and because he's taught me so much. I feel a similar way about C.S. Lewis. But it's because they help me see God the way I see Scripture talking about God. And it's because they help me see the world, and because I've been benefited from it so much. It's like I read most of what C.S. Lewis has written. I've read most of what Van Til has written because they help me understand God more. And it's like, I'm not crazy. I'm not trying to, I don't see something nuts that you guys have said. And then I say, oh no, I'm just going to wash over that because I'm a Van Tilian. Well, I'm a Van Tilian because he's helped me see God better and helped me understand the Bible and the world. And then applying that to all my life. Like you said, Van Til has helped me think theologically about everything. And sometimes, gets me in trouble with my philosopher friends because they're like, dude, just couch that. I'm like, dude, I can't couch my theology. It's there. That's how I'm seeing the whole world. I can't get rid of it.
Yeah. You can't. It's reductionistic. It's really naive to think you could reduce your theology to that. And it's the lens through which you see everything. And like I said, Lewis makes me want to see everything theologically. Edwards showed me that there was a man in history who did. Edwards did. And Van Til gives me the deep, penetrating epistemological, metaphysical justification to do so. And I'll say this, for me, it's like you're saying, it helps me see, God for who he is. But another reason why I'm so committed to Van Til is I have seen with my own eyes the way a thoroughgoing Van Tilian apologetic becomes a tool in the hands of the Holy Spirit, as it were, in the evangelism of teenagers. Yeah. And I don't know, man.
That's huge.
That's saying something.
Yeah. Dude, thanks so much for all your time here. This has been awesome. You got to come back on. People, I'm sure they're gonna be asking for it. I'm asking for it. You got to come on, talk more. Maybe we could talk Edwards
anytime. Awesome. Let's do it again. We can talk Edwards. We can talk Lewis. We can talk lifting. We can talk,
man.
Beard care. We can talk.
Okay. Love a book.
We can do whatever. But I'll come on anytime, man.
Awesome,
Thank you. And it's just good to see you. And you got to come to Nashville, man.
I'm gonna
come to Nashville. We'll take you to Hattie B's Hot Chicken. We'll show you the town.
Yeah.
We'll do it up, man.
That'll be awesome, man. I can't wait. So maybe our next one, we'll figure it out, but I'd love to get more into your work because like I said, man, I want to get this good work out there. And yeah, you said, it's kind of a niche topic, but not really when you're unpacking, like, we still got paradox left, creation, common ground. And so unpacking that for folks to understand is going to be huge. So
well, then let's do a part 2, because the creation thing.
Yes.
Basically, my goodness, Buswell claimed that Van Til did not believe in the special creation of Adam. And I think Van Til at that point had to be going, are you freaking kidding me? And again, I don't mean this disrespectfully toward Buswell. It really was an example of the relative knowledgeability between the two men of philosophical literature. Yeah. Not just the Dutch thing for Van Til, but
well, you muted yourself there. So now I can say whatever I want because no one can hear what Dr. Filson is saying here. But man, we're just all wrapped up anyway. So we're gonna finish up with a part 2. Lord willing, we'll find some time for that. We'll talk creation. We'll talk more. Van Til, you back here?
I'm back.
There we go. Awesome. All right.
Down, man.
Yeah. Well, so I just wanted to mention this too because you just brought it back up. That Van Til, he anticipated this renewal of transcendental arguments in analytic philosophy, which is so crazy because everyone can, he's following Kant. He's he's also he's following Kant in transcendental language, but also he's interacting with the idealists and they're talking transcendental here and there. But then it shifts over in like the mid 20th century over into analytic philosophy, and Strawson's talking about it. It's going over into linguistic, and so. Meanwhile, all the theologians are misinterpreting the way Van Til's using it, and he's using it actually in the way that the philosophers in the analytic tradition are using it, which is so ironic. It's so crazy to think about.
Right, exactly.
All right, so
we'll talk about that next.
We gotta do it. Part 2. Okay, so this is
part 2. You tell me when, and I'm here, man.
Awesome, man. All right, so this has been Parker's Pensies. We're gonna talk about it more, but for now, it's gonna have to do it. As always, all glory to God.